The rain fell in sheets, pounding against the windows of Clara Bennett's small apartment. She sat at her desk, staring at the old photograph in her hands. It was faded, the edges curled and yellowed with age, but the image was clear enough. A young girl, no more than 10, standing in front of a grand house with a woman who looked strikingly like her. The girl was Clara. The woman was her mother. And the house? That was the mystery. Clara had found the photograph while cleaning out her late grandmother's attic. She'd never seen it before, and her grandmother had never mentioned it. But what struck her most was the date scrawled on the back, June 12, 1995. The year her mother disappeared. Clara's mother, Evelyn Bennett, had vanished without a trace when Clara was just a child. The police had searched for months, but no one ever found her. The case went cold, and Clara was left with nothing but questions and a lifetime of grief. But now, this photograph had resurfaced, and with it, a glimmer of hope. Where had it been taken? And why had her grandmother hidden it away? Clara's fingers trembled as she traced the outline of the house in the photograph. It was a sprawling Victorian mansion, with tall windows and a wraparound porch. She didn't recognize it, but something about it felt familiar, like a memory she couldn't quite grasp. She turned the photograph over and noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint address written in pencil, 23 Willow Lane. Her heart raced. Willow Lane. She'd never heard of it, but it was a real lead. She grabbed her laptop and typed the address into a search engine. To her surprise, it came up, a small town called Blackwood, about 3 hours away. Without thinking, she packed a bag, grabbed her keys, and headed for the door. She didn't know what she'd find in Blackwood, but she had to know the truth. The drive to Blackwood was long and quiet, the rain never letting up. Clara's mind raced with possibilities. What if her mother was still alive? What if she'd been hiding all these years? Or worse, what if she'd been taken, and no one had ever bothered to look for her? Clara shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She couldn't afford to get her hopes up. Not yet. When she finally arrived in Blackwood, the town was exactly as she'd imagined, small, quiet, and eerily still. The streets were empty, the shops closed, and the only sound was the steady drum of rain against the pavement. She drove slowly, scanning the street signs until she found Willow Lane. It was a narrow, tree-lined road, with old houses set far back from the street. Number 23 was at the end of the lane, just as the photograph had shown. The house was even more imposing in person. It loomed over the street, its dark windows staring down at her like empty eyes. The paint was peeling, the porch sagging, and the yard overgrown with weeds. It looked abandoned, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. She parked her car and stepped out, the rain soaking her within seconds. She hesitated at the gate, her hand hovering over the latch. What was she doing here? What did she expect to find? She took a deep breath and pushed the gate open, the hinges creaking loudly. The sound sent a shiver down her spine, but she pressed on, climbing the steps to the porch. The front door was locked, but one of the windows was slightly ajar. Clara hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open and climbed inside. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. She pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The house was a time capsule, frozen in the mid-90s. The furniture was covered in sheets, the walls lined with faded wallpaper, and the floors littered with old newspapers and broken toys. Clara moved slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew she'd recognize it when she saw it. She found it in the study. The room was small, with a desk in the corner and shelves lined with books. But what caught her eye was the photograph on the wall. It was the same one she'd found in her grandmother's attic, the one of her and her mother standing in front of the house. But this one was larger, framed, and in better condition. And there was something else, a man standing in the background, his face partially obscured by shadow. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, squinting at the man's face. He looked familiar, but she couldn't place him. She reached out to touch the photograph, but as she did, the floorboard beneath her creaked loudly. She froze, her heart racing. And then she heard it, a sound coming from somewhere deep within the house. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood. Her stomach dropped. She wasn't alone. Clara's first instinct was to run, but something held her back. She couldn't leave now, not when she was so close to finding answers. She gripped her phone tightly and followed the sound, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. The tapping led her to a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out from the crack. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and windowless, with a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a box. The tapping had stopped, but Clara could feel a presence in the room, watching her. She approached the table slowly, her hand trembling as she reached for the box. It was old and wooden, with intricate carvings on the lid. She lifted it carefully, the hinges creaking as she opened it. Inside was a stack of letters, tied together with a ribbon. She untied the ribbon and unfolded the first letter. It was addressed to her. "Dear Clara, if you're reading this, it means you've found the house. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth before, but I hope this will help you understand. Your mother didn't disappear. She was taken. And I know who took her." Clara's hands shook as she read the words. The letter was signed by her grandmother. She quickly unfolded the next letter, and the next, each one revealing more of the story. Her mother had been involved in something dangerous, something that had put her life at risk. She'd gone into hiding to protect Clara, but someone had found her. And that someone was still out there. Clara's mind raced. Who had taken her mother? And why? She turned to the last letter, hoping for answers, but it was blank, except for a single word scrawled at the bottom: run. Before she could process what she'd read, she heard a noise behind her. She turned just in time to see a shadow move in the doorway. A man stepped into the room, his face obscured by the dim light. Clara's heart pounded as she backed away, but there was nowhere to go. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said, his voice low and menacing. Clara recognized him now. He was the man from the photograph, the one standing in the background. And he wasn't just a stranger. He was her uncle. The confrontation was brief but intense. Clara's uncle, a man she hadn't seen since she was a child, revealed the truth: he had been involved in her mother's disappearance. He'd been part of a criminal organization that had targeted her family, and he'd been hiding in Blackwood ever since. But now, Clara had found him, and he wasn't about to let her leave. Clara fought back, using everything she'd learned over the years to defend herself. She managed to escape the house, but not without a fight. She drove away from Blackwood, her mind reeling with everything she'd discovered. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She'd been taken, and Clara was determined to find her. Months later, Clara stood in front of a small house in a quiet town, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd followed every lead, pieced together every clue, and now she was here. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She looked older, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes were the same, soft, kind, and filled with love. "Clara?" the woman whispered, her voice trembling. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Mom." They embraced, the years of separation melting away in an instant. Clara had finally found her mother, and in doing so, she'd found herself.